Okay. Okay.
Thank you so much, B, for joining us with the Enneagram and Marriage podcast.
It's good to be here with you.
We are so thankful for your expertise and wisdom. And I know that many of our listeners probably know you from your own podcast. If you would like to share the name of that.
It's the Enneagram 2.0 podcast that I do with my business and teaching partner, Uranio Paez.
And it is just a wealth of information. So not only do they give you guys the backstory on each of the types, but I love how you guys also, you balance one another and you bring in the heart to the podcast too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I love that because every time we have an episode here, when I have a heart type on, there's a different layer and I get really intimidated by talking about conflict. And so it's really nice for me to bring different experts that I felt were very strong leaders to talk about how to relate with conflict when, as a 7, my tendency is to run. So even though I like to help others with it, sometimes personally, I have a bit of an issue. So it's fun for us to get to delve in with you. You've been not only an Enneagram expert, but a psychotherapist. So tell me a little bit about maybe something that you love to teach others about when you're saying, here's something I wish everyone knew about conflict resolution in marriage.
Yeah, I think I was a couples counselor for a long time. And I think the Enneagram is one of the most powerful tools to help couples work through conflict. And I'm like you as a 2. I used to be extremely conflict avoidant, and it's still challenging for me, of course. Yeah. But I think on the one hand, I've gotten better at doing it myself and engaging in conflict. And as a couples therapist, I really had to develop more of an ability to help people navigate through it. I think in marriage relationships, the most important thing is that conflict is inevitable, especially if you have a good relationship. Because it's couples that I saw that didn't have conflict that often would have bad outcomes because they would slowly disengage over time because they were avoiding talking about things that needed to be talked about in order to grow closer, actually. And so I would say the Enneagram really helps us really clarify something that's just true of everybody in conflict, which is that in the beginning of a relationship, there may be a honeymoon period and you fall in love with things about that person, but eventually over time, you start projecting your own shadow, your own stuff onto the other person, right? And in a way, couples, the longer you're together, the more danger there is of not really listening to each other, not really seeing the other person as they are, but seeing them through a lens that is colored very much by your transference with your parents, your expectations of what people are like based on your own early templates for relationship. So like if you had a parent that was really critical, imagining criticism where it isn't sometimes, those kinds of things. So I think the Enneagram really helps us clarify much more clearly what each person's lens is on the other one, and on their own experience, what their patterned ways of experiencing others is, so that can be illuminated. And once that's illuminated, it makes working through points of conflict much easier, because I think the way conflict is usefully dealt with is, okay, we're having this issue. Let's each talk about ourselves and what we're bringing to it, and when we can each own our own, feelings, beliefs, assumptions about the other person, and be humble about that and say, okay, here's what I need to own. It reduces defensiveness, and it makes it much easier to clarify what's happening and kind of unwind the conflict.
That's very good to know, because I think that we come in thinking that we basically have a right to critique our partner and change them and change their backstory up to fit what our felt needs are, when in reality, what we really need to say to one another is, help me to finish the work that I started. Don't make me so afraid to come back to what we kind of started at the beginning, which I have conceptualized into the Enneagram glow stages. And I talk about how at the beginning we're shining together, then we're healing together. And then when we enter the shadows and darkness phases of the relationship, there's the temptation to do that. And I think you just helped me by adding that next layer of saying, not only do we fall into shadow together, but we bring our former shadows and expect our partner to be able to somehow not see those, not be offended by those, and instead kind of say, like, let me live in my shadows, which is generous of us to say, let me pull you out of yours.
Mhm.
But I think we want to do that without doing our own work. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. And usually in moments of tension, it's not very generous. It's more of a, let me tell you what's wrong with you. Yeah, you're reminding me that I used to have a supervisor when I was, a clinician, that she used to say, couples come to couples therapy to fix the other person. And what they learn is they have to fix themselves. They have to heal themselves instead of seeing the other person as the problem.
Yeah.
And I think that is what I'm suggesting, is that when each person can do their own work, but in connection with the other person, that's when things shift more easily.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it's really nice to approach. So many of our listeners say, my spouse doesn't like the Enneagram. And we usually do say, make sure you come at it with humility and start owning your issues first, so that your partner really has a sense of just a little bit, it's a little bit lighter when you see, okay, I'm not being labeled. I recently had somebody say that to me in a session, even though I've been doing this work for a number of years now. And it was, hey, hang on, my wife and I have been talking, and you and her giving me a label. And I had to scale back, and it was a thinking type. So I had to scale back extra and say, hey, fellow thinking type here, I don't like labels either.
Mhm.
But at the same time, now that we're on this even playing ground of being a little less reductionistic, can we own first what we think your wife said she thinks she contributed? And then, of course, now the scales fall off of, okay, I'm not in a corner. People are owning their own things. So I love that that's kind of your first tip, is own your things, own your shadows.
Mhm. Right, right. And if there's someone whose partner isn't into the Enneagram and resists it, and the best way to allow that person to overcome their resistance is to talk about the things they don't like about you and how you can see what that's all about through the Enneagram, right? It's like, you don't like this about me. Well, let me tell you about that. Here's where it
Oh,
comes
I
from,
like
and here's what
that.
I know about it. And here, and the person's going to be sold. It's like, wow, like that helped you see what I was trying to get you to see all this time. That's
Right.
going to be powerful. So you can
Oh,
talk about yourself for a while and not need them to
yeah.
see themselves in a particular way. So yeah, that's important.
Oh, I love that. And then when you start talking about them, as you're alluding to, it's a more generous illumination of,
Right.
and I've thought through a little bit of your story. Maybe you can tell me if this resonates, very gently coming in to see if it fits with that Columbo effect we learned in college and grad school. But it's, hey, I don't know if I'm right here, but if this is true about you, help me to see if this is something that you're feeling as you bring into the marriage. So
Right.
it's
Right.
a bit of a gentler dance.
Right. And also even focusing on what the impact on you is of what they're doing. Like, I don't know what's going on with you, right? Because when people feel you trying to get inside them and tell them what they're about, they're gonna put up their defenses, and they should, right? Because that's in a way. And I think when we get excited about the Enneagram, I think it's just a natural product of being excited about the Enneagram that we start seeing things in people,
Yeah.
and so it makes sense. And if people start feeling like you're seeing, you're thinking you're knowing things about them that they aren't saying themselves, that can be a big reason to hold up a boundary. But if you're saying, here's the impact, you do this thing, and here's the impact on me, and here's what my type says about what that says about me, and these are dynamics. It's not like anybody's fault. But yeah, I experience this when I'm with you. And I know that part of that is about me,
Yeah.
but I invite you to explore what's going on for you,
I
and
love
because you're right, it needs to be very carefully done so that, because anyone who feels like people are trying to push them into a corner
that.
is going to act like they're cornered. And
Yeah.
that just makes sense.
Yes. And I think as people have so much struggle in the years, I notice anyway, research based around year 5 and year 12 of marriage for different reasons as we head into child rearing often, as well as middle marriage and the losses that are in both of those seasons. But what I notice is that sometimes if you're able to, and I'm not judging anyone who's divorced, but able to head on into those middle years by some strength, sometimes what's neat I've noticed is that the kids can help each of you as well to be a bit more of a reflection, to say,
Mhm.
I noticed that too about each of you. And so then
Mhm.
there's the Enneagram, another layer of extended family saying, hey, these are some patterns that we're all noticing. And if we're going to push on with that collective, like we're getting our self-care, we're doing our one-to-one care or our small group, how are we going to be most effective out in the world if we can't even look here in this middle dynamic? So I think that it's neat to think about all the different places and ways we could find some growth through conflict, but we're both agreeing as a 2 and a 7, we need to do it gently, right?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, of course.
So could you
Mhm.
tell us a little bit about how you see the instincts playing a role in marriage care when it comes to conflict? Because I think this is just huge. And I've heard you talk
Mm.
about it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think one of the things the instinct level of the Enneagram types points out to us is that we are animals, that we have this instinctual level that especially may get stirred up when we're threatened,
Yeah.
and we can act very much from the instinctual. Now, in the human personality, of course, the instincts combine with or get driven by our ego.
Mm.
And that's one of the biggest problems, is that not that our instincts are a problem. We need our instincts to survive in the world. But when they combine with our ego and its priorities,
Mhm.
sometimes it brings out the most unconscious behavior in us. So it helps to understand your dominant instinct and sometimes your whole instinctual sequence. The first one that tends to take up the most real estate in your experience, the second one, and then the repressed instinct also often has a big impact.
Yes.
So, for instance, someone who is self-preservation dominant, and again, I always caution you need to also look at your subtype, not just your dominant instinct or sequence,
Thank you.
because these instincts show up differently depending on what type we are. But generally, understanding your dominant instinct and the instinct of your partner helps a
Mhm.
lot, because there are some basic things that we can kind of be at odds with each other around, that are much more easily understood at the instinctual level. So if I'm self-preservation dominant, which I am, it
Yeah.
can be a little bit like resistance to change.
Yes.
So, if you're suggesting we change something, my first answer will be no.
Yeah. Yes.
And the more you insist, the less I may look at that. I need to sort of slow down and know that about myself and say, okay, I just need time to get used to this. Also with a self-preservation dominant instinct, there can be a little bit more of a tendency to, I'm just going to go it on my own. Like if you don't get me, if you're not there for me and the way I define it, like, well, forget about you. And I may withdraw. I may, do things more on my own as an unconscious way to punish the other person, or just out of a fear that I won't be able to depend on you. Because that sort
Mm.
of anxiety, difficulty trusting, these can be things that come along with being self-preservation dominant.
I
And so
love
the
that.
go it alone kind of strategy, again, sometimes it seems like it makes perfect sense, like
Yeah.
you're acting like this, why would I depend on you? But when we see that it's a part of that really strong instinctual drive that can really get going when we're under threat in a relationship, then that's important.
That
And
is important.
of course,
And
there are other biases with the others as well.
and maybe we could take a few minutes to talk about each of them a little bit more. Do you mind if I delve in a little deeper on even the
Sure.
SP?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so I love that you and I share that subtype, just because it makes me feel safe as an SP. And I think that a lot of our listeners are just learning. I always forget that people are just learning all the time, because I'm a future thinker. So I'm always headed in, oh, we're all on this exact same. And a lot of my listeners are listening. I haven't heard, maybe haven't heard an episode in 10 episodes. So I think that it's important that they might even just be reminded now that they might think, wait a minute, I thought it was my type that mattered. And what B and I are saying is you have something even deeper going on at the animal instinctual level. So you might be a 2 like B and not realizing that trust is even an issue for you. Would you say it like that for a self-pres person?
Yeah, I would say that there are different dimensions to the Enneagram, and you can learn a lot from all of them, and some of them even kind of put together, kind of creating more like pieces of the puzzle that are kind of all informative. And I would say, yes, knowing your type is really important basic information, and that will tell you a lot. And then knowing your dominant instinct will tell you more. And then putting that together with your type, that shows what your subtype is, and subtype patterns tell you a lot. And then again, what your whole instinctual sequence is, what instinct tends to get repressed or just not in the picture at all, can also have an impact. So there are different dimensions. And as you learn more, you get access to more and more information.
Which is so cool. And I think why most of us are just realizing this is a lifelong process. Yeah. So there's grace, because it's, for me at least, very slow, at times painful. And that's very hard. So I think that that's important for the self-pres people out there who, yes, I've done episodes on this, but if you haven't heard, or even if you have, check out B's show on this, because they talk about it a lot. As well as in their masterclass, which I love. But you can also just even now analyze with us, am I a person who tends to kind of lock up, like she said, and kind of need time to process change and want my materials near me? And what is the backstory on that? Sometimes it's even nice to go back into the collective, like I can say my Croatian grandmother and the depression. And, she was always telling me, you have to save everything, and memories where somebody maybe took something from me. And then this is the fascinating piece with marriage is I married somebody who is so high in the social. I was social with him for so long. I got so burnt out in my social 7 that I almost collapsed. So now I've had to come into self-pres, and I tested so high in self-pres after I lost my parents that it was in the 90th something percentile. So I also kind of noticed a major shift. So it just kind of gives our listeners a sense of, yes, I'm using a story to tell you from my life, but I hope you can put it into your life too, that maybe there's even been a bit of a shift because of the marriage dynamic. Does that make sense? Or the family history?
Yeah. That those all are important pieces. I think when we find out our dominant instinct, we've found that there are a lot of like themes in the family system or historical experiences that have this deep or almost held in the body or held in our psyches. So you find, for instance, people who are self-pres dominant, they connect to something in their family system, like their ancestors went through a famine or war or some sort of deprivation. Like it's interesting. And I'm half Irish and half Portuguese. And on both sides, especially the Portuguese side, my not so distant ancestors came from a lot of poverty. It's very interesting. And with my Irish side, it goes back farther. You have to go back a few more generations to get there, but still. So those kinds of things. And yes, absolutely. When you're in relationship, it's very interesting to note how you're different, if you have different instincts, or if you have the same one, what happens because of that. Like if your partner has a social instinct, how does that impact you, both in terms of what happens in your relationship and what happens with you, like you say, when you subtly adapt to the other person to support that connection.
Right. And I don't want people to lose heart either, because as you say that, I think about how the people in my life, and I'm sure the same is true for listeners and for you, that we do help one another not to get totally stuck. So for those who are self-pres people, there's a bit of a comfort with knowing, even though I am this way, my family, which is strange, appear all 4 of them to be social subtypes, they really balance me out. But sometimes I just run under my blankets and I'm like, I'm done. I'm done for the day. I need 1 hour of peace. And I think that sometimes I even go too far and I say, what did I do to create for them not to want to be self-pres? And then I have to like, okay, stop. Like, that's not helpful. Just take your hour to rest and then join the wild family. But I think that I think long-term will learn from the self-pres. And then we're not talking yet about the sexual, but we will. I just want to give our listeners that sense of like the fluidity of this and how we're still kind of learning and balancing. At least I am.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And as usual, the main thing is awareness. You know, it's not like something should be another way, or there's something wrong with being a certain way or having a particular instinct or a relationship that's a certain way. It's more about, okay, this is what is. This is there must be a reason, something for me to learn from being around all these socials, right? And like you say, when you're not very conscious of it, you can maybe overcompensate and just try to be more like them to fit in, or maybe that's part of a self-preservation strategy. But what you're exactly like you're saying, what's even better is if you become really aware and in the pressure of being with people with different instincts, you can say, okay, hold on. I honor the way you are, and I need to be even more clear about what I need so that I can both, take care of myself, but also be flexible to be able to, because with the instincts, it's about, again, first awareness, but also then like, how do you even them out? How do you bring up the instincts that are less there? And how do you kind of rein in the dominance of the one that's most drives your behavior?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I like how you have shared on your podcast and in your masterclass, just to kind of help us to understand the sequencing better. If people are wondering, what do we mean by sequencing? I think that based on a basic level, though, we can remember that you said one of them is dominant, and we're kind of talking about the self-pres and moving on from that in a minute. But we also have a repressed instinct that we kind of don't really want to visit very much, or maybe we feel burnt out on. But then I've also been just fascinated by the fact that you remind us, don't forget the second one too, because that one could really get us stuck in marriage also when you're, or life. But I mean, when you're thinking, I'm good there, it's fine. It's fine. And it's like, I'm actually not really tending to that one at all. Have you noticed that too in conflict?
I have noticed that people don't really pay much attention to that one. And so on the one hand, they don't. So the way I see the sequence is that one kind of dominates your experience. And if you're not very aware, it takes up all the space. It drives a lot of what you do. Now, again, especially combined with your type to create subtype patterns. Now, the second one, some people say it's normal, well, I don't see it that way. I see it can either be somewhat repressed, or at times it can function in ways that aren't optimal. Let's say it that way. But here's the thing about the second one. It's the easiest to change. It's the easiest with work, with sort of conscious attention to allow it to function as it should. Now, it might be good for people to remember this, like when we're really, really healthy, it's not that we don't have our instincts operating, it's that they operate as necessary or not. So in other words, if I'm not in a situation where my survival is being challenged or threatened, and a particular instinct would help me, then it may not, fire off. It may not happen. When we're really healthy and our egos aren't driving the show, it's almost like our instincts get activated and they don't get activated based on what's objectively happening in external reality, right? But when we're in our egos, by definition, we're more focused on our own kind of, basically history, our own sort of reactions or a reactivity that's about protecting our image or protecting our ego. And that's when we kind of go wrong. Like, for instance, in a relationship where we may get stuck in a dynamic with someone that never gets healed and eventually leads to a breakup, right? If you're doing something that bothers me, I'm doing something that bothers you, and we can't stop doing it, because when you do what you do, I react. And when I react, you react to me. And we're in an endless cycle of reactivity. And so, to go back to the first question, the way we unravel that conflict is by studying our own reactivity to the
Mhm.
point where we get to be experts on, oh, now I understand what's happening at an unconscious level. It's about making what's unconscious more conscious. So when we get to the instincts, it's about how can I stop all my instincts from either over functioning or under functioning, like getting fired off. Like, so when, I sometimes say, like, if you're not being chased by a lion, maybe your self-pres instinct doesn't need to be firing off so much,
Mhm.
I tend to give the example of myself and food, because my
Mhm.
self-pres
Oh, I
instinct
get it.
gets focused a lot toward, like, where's my next meal coming
Yes.
from? And is it going to be good? And do I have enough? Whereas
Mhm.
in my life, I'm privileged enough that there's no chance of starvation. There's absolutely no chance that my life is threatened by not having enough. So it's like the fact that there's anxiety about that is the problem, right? Because there's no reason for it. So with the second instinct, I often think it's actually good to kind of pay attention to that and build it up to work in healthy ways. So for instance, as a self-preservation too, even though I have social second, my social instinct sometimes was under functioning. For instance, when I first started, like, speaking in a group,
Yeah.
I would get super emotional and wouldn't be able to speak. Like, when I was doing group work as part of my psychotherapy training, every time I would talk, I would cry.
Yeah.
Like, that's not really, the social behavior that you want to do. Also, social is connected to friendship and leadership. And so, like, I took a group facilitation training course. I became a leader of an organization. These are things that at first felt really weird and foreign, which signals that I'm not social dominant. But I was able over time to really bring up that social instinct much more. Whereas now I like speaking in front of people. And most social twos will say they like speaking in front of people, that they have an
True.
easy time of it. They
Yeah.
don't feel scared. But it took me some work to get there, but I'm there. Whereas with the repressed instinct, that's a little bit harder. It's almost like you've given up on that, or that whole thing is not part on your radar screen. And that takes some work. Now, some people say you should work on your repressed instinct first. I don't think so, only because it's just not going to work, because the dominant instinct will kind of keep coming in and taking over. So I think you can work on all three at once, but I think working on the dominant instinct first and then bringing the second instinct up are sort of the first stage of work. And then later, when you have that a little more in your awareness, then I think working on the repressed instinct and certainly observing how it may show up, usually not proactively, usually after the fact, can be a good thing to do as well.
Oh, that's fascinating. That really adds to our learning here. Thank you, because we've been really looking at it from, as I said, let's build up and reuptake with self-pres, which I'm aware of as the host of the show, that I choose that one first. But then I always say, you got to put your oxygen mask on. And then the second instinct, I say, get your one-to-one, your family healthy, and then move out into the world, like I mentioned. But I really like you saying, and I do say what comes first, the chicken or the egg sometimes, because I'm like, if you just stop where you're at, you're not in a vacuum anyway. You can just start that cycle. But I also like you saying a healthy way to work on this is which one is the most comfortable, because that's going to be the easiest, safest place. Just like we said with spouses, you've got to find the place of least resistance and least defensiveness. And then, like you said, even just scale back a little there. Are you really needing that much self-pres? And then, or sexual or social. And that way, then you can move into the second one, which isn't as hard, which I love how you shared. Now speaking is much easier for you. And then lastly, that last one, you said the one that's toughest is where we work on last. And that's helpful for marriage too, because with our spouse, whether we share the instinct or not, I think our collective goal as spouses and as a culture is that we'd be healthy and balanced in all of them, right?
Right, right. Yeah. I would make one slight distinction. And that
Mhm.
is, while I think that, like, working on the repressed instinct probably needs to come last, I
Yeah.
do think it's good to observe how that absence impacts you in your relationships, right?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
my business partner and podcast co-host is self-preservation repressed, right? So,
Mm.
we travel together, we work together, we teach together, and that impacts our relationship a lot. There's
Yeah.
certain things that he just doesn't pay attention to, that gets him in trouble, that sometimes gets us in trouble. And of course, I over focus on that. And sometimes I feel like I have to do that to compensate, And so him being more conscious and aware of that, that is the way he is, helps us not get into a polarity, which happens a lot with couples, where one person's doing all of one thing and the other person sort of takes the other pole. And the more they do that, the more separated they get. Whereas it can help for the other person to kind of take on the other person's usual role, so that people don't get stuck and separated from each other through these kinds of polarities.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I love your personal example that you're saying, even as much as you know about the Enneagram and have done so much self-work, that there's also a lot of grace that we need to give to ourselves in the process, because we get stuck. And I always try to come from that perspective. I hope I come off that way, that we're just in process and learning about this, being open and curious about it helps you so much to be able to say not only about the type, but the instincts, to say, I notice that I happen to run this way. I also love the stories we can tell that disarm our partners about, I wonder if this story is true for you about your one-to-one or your social drive or your SP drive. And that just gives them permission to not be perfect, which I think they really appreciate. Like, oh, thank you for acknowledging that I didn't just, these survival instincts have helped me so much, quite honestly. So if we can do this important work as a couple to get balanced, I think that's beautiful. And I do have a planner that I have a lot of my couples going through, that I created, which has every single week, you have to talk through ways you're balancing your instincts. And my husband and I have been doing this for, January and February so far. And it's been very insightful, because he doesn't do he's self-pres repressed also. So he's like, oh, I just can't work out because I don't have time. And so I've been kind of dragging him out. But what I look forward to, as one recent guest said on the podcast, instead of a dragging, it's more of a bringing. And I think that was a beautiful way to say, like, this is how it sort of evolves with that repressed. And I think he's sort of bringing me socially versus dragging me. And I can see it happening, but it's awkward, so we have to be careful of that. So what tips would you have for people who are in that self-pres? We talked a lot about that as we introed the whole topic, but I just would love it if there was like one or two tips for couples who are just, hey, I'm self-pres. How could we work through that in marriage?
Again, I think a lot of it is about just observing, noticing, like, oh, there I go again. I'm noticing I'm doing this without any judgment, and being able to share about that. Like, oh, here's what I noticed in myself today. And I think sometimes if we can just make that more conscious in an ongoing way, that right there kind of lessens some of the force behind it, because you kind of create more room for not judging yourself, for just allowing yourself to be the way you are. And then through observing it, it's sort of like, oh, I can see how that's not working. I can see how, I can understand where this impulse comes from, like needing to be alone or not trusting you, or, but what if I just allowed that to be true, but tried to work it on the edges, like try to take a leap of faith and trust you a little more, notice that I tend to resist change and try to be a little more flexible, kind of working those. And we often say that with instincts and subtypes, it's a lot about behavior. It's a lot about what you do, not what you're imagining about yourself, right? It's like, okay, look at what you actually did. Right? You said notice something before thinking about it. Can you say, let me think about that and tell you in 2 days, and really work with yourself to say, okay, my natural resistance, because I fear for my safety, is this, but what if I gave it a try?
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you so much. I've done it so bad. And I see myself sometimes making those little changes. And I know our listeners are just with us. They're doing the baby steps. So it's a beautiful example for a self-pres. Now tell us about the sexual subtype and something they might be able to do when they're just so dominant in it and their spouse is trying to pull them a little bit behind, maybe because you shared a bit about self-pres and how there's a bit of history to that, maybe a bit about that too. And what do you think the history is with sexual?
So I think with sexual, dominance, it's a lot about the other is everything,
Mhm.
right? It's a lot about everything happens through the relationship, right? And there can be too much intensity, too much focus, too much pressure on the other person to relate to you in a particular way, to be really intense, to be really merged in certain ways, in ways that other people, if they're not sexual dominant, might resist, but also ways that they may that may not be good for the relationship. Actually, sexual dominance can think, well, if this relationship is everything, then it must be great to be with me, but if you're overdoing that, if you're requiring too much from your partner, if you're not spreading around your needs in your life to other people, to being able to be more on your own, then that tends to put too much pressure on the relationship. Sexuals need to be more okay being by themselves, get more of their needs met by friends, and not need to get so much fuel from that particular bond.
Oh, that's so important. I love it that they reuptake themselves, that they find a way to, there's so much energy there to kind of pull back a little bit of that bigness and on the one person and say, like, I want to spread this out so that I don't overwhelm that person.
Right.
And I think their spouses really appreciate that so much because they're like, I can have a bit of breathing room and come back to being fascinated by you, because we need that pursuer distancer a little bit in marriage, and say, yeah, you're pretty special. You are pretty great. That's why I love your vibrancy. But I don't feel controlled. And maybe sometimes there's even a bit of a history of some sort of oppression. Sometimes I get that one in the social confused a bit, but do you feel that sometimes there's a bit of a abuse history with the sexual subtype?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the sort of instinctual family system ancestral theme, is some sort of abuse. It can be physical abuse, sexual abuse, even homicide, because the energy of the sexual instinct is about rivalry. So it's like they tend to be more competitive, more aggressive, not all subtypes, not all types, but there tends to be that kind of intensity of like pushing someone out of the way to get to the partner, which can lead to kind of violent tendencies. But again, that's at a very unconscious level. And sometimes it's just where it comes from in the family system.
Yeah. And I think that you sharing that and me trying to enunciate that to our listeners will help them not only in marriage, but friendships. Because I know that
Yes.
when I feel assaulted in a friendship, I go, oh my gosh, I'm going to be overtaken because I'm not really that competitive in that way. And so it makes me retreat. Now, what I want to recommend to spouses and friends is I don't want to lose the friendship just because I need a pause. So I've learned to come back, and even if they're kind of over talking, I try to not leave. I notice a lot of people just done, never doing this again. And I try to man, I know everyone does this to them. I'm going to stay, but I'm going to pause first. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. 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 Ask for a little space, but say, I'm not going away.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if spouses could do that, I don't have a sexual subtype spouse, but if they could do that, that would be so safe for the sexual subtype to know, like, if I don't overpower you, you might leave me. But if I know that you're just going to take a pause and you're going to let me know I love you, a term of endearment, and I'll be back, I think that gives them a bit of safety.
Yeah.
So, oh my gosh, thank you for clarifying that difference. And then the social subtype, when we have a partner who's so overpowering here, how do you think they can grow in marriage or their partners?
I think social dominants can recognize that they get a lot of their energy from the group or the community or being with other people, and that sometimes that's a great thing. Sometimes that helps the family be more connected to extended family or to other people in the community or to friends. So it's a good thing, as with all of these traits, there's an upside and a downside, I like to say, about everything. But I also think that when social is overdone, there can almost be a unconscious avoidance of the relationship by going out to everybody else. If I'm at a party, I'm with everybody else and I'm having a great time, but I'm not really with my partner, and so I think learning to create a balance between social contact and being with others in groups or even at work or things like that. And also prioritizing the relationship and challenging yourself to be really present, to go deeper with with one person, and also take care of yourself, and seeing those things as all equally important, and not unconsciously getting your needs met through being a leadership position or being with groups or some sort of way that your image or your reputation is burnished by what you do in the community, not overdoing that, and not looking for all your life gratification through those kinds of experiences, and balancing them out.
Wow, that is really helping me to reflect on just different prisms, if you will, of parts of this that I haven't even looked at. And it's making me think, I can see how in marriage we might really screw each other up and bless each other when we can start to learn some steps here, or even kind of clumsily go through them. Because if our spouse is one of these subtypes or instincts that kind of just we're used to it, is what I've been noticing lately, is we can keep each other stuck in these shadows, because it's like, hey, I'm self-pres, you're social, I want you to grow in social. But once you start coming into my space, I don't know what to do. So I think that it also takes a bit of a bravery to say to that social person, if they're not going to find their identity anymore in the crowd, are you going to show up for them more at home? Because I think we have to nurture our spouses as they're changing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And sometimes we just need to communicate more about all that.
Yeah, that's true. And I have to dose it because my husband's like, you've been with me for 20 years doing this, and I need to have you dose it. So I do dose it. And he comes back and he brings it back up.
That's
He's a
great.
1, and he's like, oh, I'm a 1 and I do this. So then I can enter in again. But you do have to do that dance with your partner. And like B said, when there's an inroads, go deep. With that social instinct, do you think that there's a layer of oppression in some way for them too?
You mean something?
Historically.
Yes, definitely. It often comes from a history of some sort of um, like being being kept out of the group, excommunicated. Sometimes it comes from some sort of slavery or being publicly shamed. And there's a word that's not coming to me. It has to do with, it's not excommunicated. It's
Exiled, pariah.
exiled,
Okay.
exiled, banished, those kinds of things of, sometimes it can be religious in the history, sometimes, persecuted for your religion or your culture, those kinds of things. One culture kind of enslaving another, all those kinds of things can be part of a history. And so there's also social repressed people who can have a similar thing. And sometimes it's like a fear of being like really called out and persecuted in public.
Oh, wow. These dimensions go so deep. So that's why it's so important that we take time with them. But the
Yeah.
rewards are great. And so I don't know if you have a moment to end on maybe some of the rewards of doing instinctual work.
Absolutely. I think in some ways, when we aren't more conscious and aware of our instinctual drivers and how they express themselves through our personality is the way I'd put it. And this is why it's good to know your type and your subtype. It's like they drive the show. They're in danger of, it's like with our instincts, our heads don't come into it. The instincts are so fast. Like if a thought sort of travels at the speed of X, a feeling travels at the speed of 10X, and an instinctual impulse travels at the speed of 100X. This is the reptilian brain. It's so fast. And so usually we can only sort of see it in retrospect. It's hard to stop ourselves through self-observation with the instincts. But if we can say, wow, look at what I just did, or what I did yesterday, and how my instinctual reaction just really took over. The more we bring that into awareness, without criticizing ourselves, the more we can kind of loosen up. We can sort of reassure ourselves and get reassurance from others, but also learn to loosen up the ways, the rigid ways or kind of knee-jerk ways that the instincts can drive what we do, to the point where we kind of are out of control. We're not having the capability of directing what we do in our relationships with more conscious awareness, more choice. And so it's having a lot of patience with yourself and a lot of compassion, but also studying these things to the point where we can realize, okay, I'm going to need to do something differently. And that sometimes that means practice something differently or experiment with something differently, but I need to change the way I react and the way I do things, because when it's driven by the instinct in an unconscious way, I don't have any freedom in my life. And that includes the freedom to improve my relationships. So I would say study it, be with it, understand it, and try to, and again, more with the instincts than with other things, try to do things differently and see what happens, and practice and get better at doing things differently rather than being controlled by your instincts or your subtype patterns.
Yeah, that's really a good motivator for people, just to hear, freedom, a temporary loss of control so that you can ultimately get healthier and not lose your relationships. This is so key, because I know we're doing them because we think it's going to keep everything healthy, but it's hurting us. And I do notice that after a while in relationships with a friend or a spouse or an adult child, you realize I have to shift something, or my intentions don't matter. It's not going well. So the person isn't going to respond well. So I do think sometimes there's that exterior motivator, but sometimes, like you said, if you can catch it first, it can be you just knowing, hey, I'm going to benefit so much if I let go of a little bit of this. But I also love the grace you shared of, here's why, because you have this family history where there was some starvation with both the Portuguese side and the Irish side. I know when the Irish came to America, it was really difficult. Same with Croatian in my family. They were really taken to the mines and, often not given jobs. And I know my grandmother's ran a boarding house, and she whispered it into my ear almost every night to tell me. So there's great, beautiful stories about what these people did for our survival. And it's very moving, but I guess we're all learning together. We don't have to be quite so extreme as long as we keep moving forward. Right.
Right. And we actually honor our ancestors when we learn to go beyond what they had to do to survive, instead of it being kind of programmed into us, to be able to be more aware of our programming and realizing, oh, I don't have to react to this. I can choose something different. And that's when I think it's really important, is to create more room for conscious choice of doing things differently. And I think most importantly, I think where this often happens, where we actually sort of, where the rubber meets the road, is actually doing something difficult, in your relationship. Like, I know I've had these moments in time where like everything in me wanted to be mad at someone out in my life, and to be able to get over the anger and talk to the person about how they hurt me, or ask for help from someone. Like there've been these moments where I'm like, oh, everything in me says, I can't do this. I can't talk about this. I can't, but if I can do it, that's when the reward comes. Like everything in me is saying, I don't want to share this with you, or I don't want to communicate this, or I don't want to have to shift this thing about myself that's a problem for me and you. But I can take the risk of really trying to do it. That's when I think huge shifts are possible, and when life gets better and there are rewards we didn't dream of.
I know, it's beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm thinking of a text that I brought up, an emotional song to my husband, and he said that was a little too much for him. And then the next day he sent me a song, and he said, I was thinking about what you said. And this is so silly, but this is how we micro communicate, is I had the option to either heart the song or ignore it. And I started out ignoring it, and I'm like, I'm going to heart it. So like these little movements toward each other are so beautiful. And it's the bigger healing, like you said, that our ancestors would have wanted for us. It's our way of carrying on the legacy work that they started. And so that's just such a fascinating piece. I'm going to keep listening to you guys, because you go deep like that. And I love that. We're trying to do the work with you here at Enneagram and Marriage. So where can our listeners continue to learn from you guys?
So there's a lot they can access at our website, cpenneagram.com. We have a new book that came out in October, the Enneagram Guide to Waking Up. Find your path, face your shadow, discover your true self. But mainly you can find out about our courses and programs at cpenneagram.com.
Okay, perfect. I loved your love languages course. And as I said, your ongoing masterclass, your podcast. You guys are delving in as well as just helping people for free, which is such a beautiful combination.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been wonderful being with you, Christa.
Yay.